You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Leading the Factory Forward. This is episode number 90, and we're going to be talking about emotional intelligence and the entrepreneur. In this podcast, my goal is to help you create a compelling future for yourself, your teams, and your organizations. I always encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of the podcast episode and use that as a tool to capture notes as you explore the ideas of these episodes. Or to help get you started on your journey and to stay up to date on new episodes, please download the free worksheet, 3 Steps You Need for a More Productive Workday. So today we're going to revisit this idea of emotional intelligence and how it impacts you as a leader, whether you're on your own or whether you're leading a small or medium-sized company or leadership of any context. Now, the Goldman EI Group has talked about 10 challenges facing corporations with respect to emotional intelligence, and I'll just raise 3 of them for you today. First is employee engagement, retention, and attraction. And again, we're trying to get people back to work. We're using remote work. We're trying to expand our talent profiles. So all of these things is how, as leaders and as organizations, engage employees, retain employees, and then attract new employees, especially, employees from different backgrounds. The next piece is leadership development. Again, we have a lot of new leaders. We're trying to develop a wider range of leaders. So it's important that leaders, of course, have emotional intelligence. It's just not about the technical skills. It really is about the interpersonal skills too. And finally, innovation and transformation. Every organization or every individual, whether they want to or not, are going to have to innovate to stay in the game, and they're going to have to transform as the technology and just the whole global village marches on. We have to continually reinvent ourselves and our businesses. And there are 12 competencies in the Goldman EI description of emotional intelligence, and I'll just mention 4 of them for today. The first is self-awareness. In other words, can you stop, reflect, look on yourself, what you're doing, what you've done? So can you reflect on yourself? The second one is emotional balance. Okay, having reflected on yourself as you live in the world, work with other people, can you maintain a balance so that your emotions, which are very valid and real, but they don't get carried away and make you less effective than you hope to be? The third one is empathy. Self-awareness is how you understand yourself. Empathy is really talking about how do you understand others? And do you really take the time to listen? For me, empathy fundamentally starts with listening. Are you deeply listening to people? And then the final one is adaptability. Again, whether as senior leaders or people in existing organizations, we do have processes. We want to execute things flawlessly. But again, change is always happening in the world around us. And so we have to be adaptable and think about our processes and other people around us. Now, Fast Company had an interesting article, and it was around emotional intelligence and responding to people who don't share your values. Obviously, in this world, there's a wide diversity of values on a wide diversity of subjects, whether it be global culture, whether it be racism, any number of things that we don't agree on necessarily. So what do you do about that? How do you actually try to be effective as a leader in this situation? Well, they suggest 4 things. You can choose to learn, and in that, you want to consciously say, I'm going to go out and understand how people are talking about things, how people are thinking about things. I want to, really understand more about who people are, where they're coming from, as well as maybe I have to understand myself. As you think of the global village, how well do I understand the backgrounds, the culture of the people of India or China or anywhere else in the world? So I have to have a stance where you choose to learn. And then you have to seek understanding of other people, especially those who you don't share values with, or at least you assume you don't. And you have to go in with the idea that seeking understanding does not mean agreement. I had a good friend once that said, in most cases, people are doing what makes sense to them. Now, it may not make sense to us and may not fit with our values whatsoever, but most people are somewhat rational and do what makes sense to them. So it's one of those things where you have to understand that doesn't mean you ever have to say, oh, and I agree with you. Another thing I've done in mindfulness training is there's a particular practice where, especially when considering people you have conflict with, They have a mindfulness practice called Just Like Me, and they step you through a series of questions where, okay, as human beings on this planet, we share some things. Those are there too. While it's clear that we disagree on things, we understand where we share. The third thing they mentioned in that article is embracing curiosity and having patience. And yet, acknowledging that emotions are involved, whether it be our own emotions or other people's emotions. And I have encouraged this over the years for people who are worried about a challenging conversation. And it may be with a performance issue, it may be with a different person, whatever it is. But I encourage them to be curious, really ask questions. And again, jumps back to that seek to understand. And then you have to have patience. Again, it's interesting, and I've been through some exercises and listening where we actually let people talk uninterrupted for 5 minutes. And that's pretty uncomfortable for people. But it's amazing that all of a sudden you're learning a lot more when you're actually just forced to sit there and listen, and somebody is forced to, in a sense, speak for 5 minutes on whatever they're thinking about. But then, again, there's emotions always involved in these things, whether it be ours or others. So patience also is not responding or reacting. It's the emotional self-control. I'm not going to trigger my emotions, in response to maybe what they're feeling. And then the final point that they mention is staying with the conversation. Some of my work with labor relations in the past, I remember a guy said, we want to have a conversation about this issue. We just don't want to have a drive-by shouting. And sometimes in today's world, that is. We just get in front of people and start shouting our opinions and our feelings and our values, and we don't stay in conversation. And again, it is hard. This is not an easy thing because, again, as people who don't share your values, they may have things that trigger your emotions. Likewise, your values may be triggering their emotions. So having patience to stay in a conversation is key, and it's also hard. I know it's hard. I had a good teacher and friend once, Paul Axtell, say, you need to stay in the conversation until it works for both of you. And you can imagine that if I'm having a difficult conversations because somewhere along the line, I feel I'm right and they're wrong. So how do we really keep having a conversation until it works for both of us? It's never easy to do, and I won't try to minimize it. So what are we to do on some of these things? I mentioned a few things that have occurred to me over the time, but I also just saw an article from Susan David, who wrote the book, Emotional Agility. She grew up in South Africa, and they have a saying, a Zulu saying there, a greeting that says, I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. But this whole idea of being seen, again, I think it has to do a lot with listening, but again, be a person we're deeply disagreeing with, but we have to talk it through and always acknowledge that they're a person. They may be what we feel is an evil person, but they are a person, and we have to at least acknowledge them. And once people are heard, that can make all the difference in the world, whether or not you agree with them, and many times you won't. The second thing is a little harder, or it takes more time, but it's from Marshall Goldsmith. And he came up with a series of self-reflection where he has actually another person ask him several questions every day. And I think at one point it was 23 questions, just so that he could keep his attention on things that mattered to him. And while it wasn't specifically around emotional intelligence, I think you'll see that some of it really fits in there. So the 6 key questions he has is, did I do my best to increase my happiness yesterday? Did I do my best to find meaning? Did I do my best to be engaged? And again, this is kind of what the emotional intelligence piece is. Did I do my best to build positive relationships? Did I do my best to set clear goals? And did I do my best to make progress towards goal achievement? So these are more questions than probably we were addressing just around emotional intelligence, but you can see it's an interesting framework. But this whole idea, did I do my best to be engaged? And do I do my best to build positive relationships? Those are the ones that are probably linked most closely to what we're talking about with emotional intelligence. Well, that's kind of a wrap for today. And we talked about these ideas. The emotional and intelligence challenges facing corporations, and 3 of them I mentioned were employee engagement, retention, and attraction, leadership development. We have new leaders coming on board, leaders from a wide variety of backgrounds, and how do we help them become successful? Then innovation and transformation. What are the many things that we have to do individually and with our organizations to recreate ourselves and be a useful part of the future? And then the 4 competencies that I mentioned with respect to EI that I think really help in these areas and that we talked about today were self-awareness. How well do I know myself? Have I reflected on what I'm doing and how other people are seeing me? Emotional balance. Okay, how do I respond? Is there a moment there between what happens and how I respond? And can I do something positive about that? And it's just not an emotional hijack every time something triggers me. Then the next piece was understanding others, empathy. And as I said, from my perspective, empathy is a lot about listening. So the more you can listen, the longer, the deeper you can listen. It doesn't mean you have to agree, but the more you can listen, I think the better things can turn out. And then finally, the whole adaptability piece. How do we change? So whether it be I need to change myself because I'm now going to be in a global village as opposed to maybe just in North America, or how do I change myself working remotely, or how do I change my organization as we, again, have to adopt new tools, processes, and technologies. So those are the 4 EI competencies that I chose to talk about today. So what's up next? We're going to continue a mix of solo episodes and interviews as we go through this. But again, some will be around manufacturing, but many will just be general leadership topics. And also, obviously, I'm going to be talking more about the silver entrepreneur. Again, how people can start an encore career, how we can re-engage this talent that may be sitting on the sidelines in retirement. And then, finally, how could this talent help you as leaders in organizations as you move forward? So finally, as always, I encourage you to visit my website, download the summary at the bottom of the podcast, and use it to help you as you start exploring these ideas. Or to help you get started on your journey and to stay up to date on new episodes, please download the free worksheet, 3 Steps You Need for a More Productive Workday. And stay tuned to the podcast to learn more about a free webinar that I'm planning on the 4 questions that will improve your encore career selection. So looking forward to that, and I'll be sharing more as we go along. So thanks for listening.